Paper piecing fun and a snail's trail block is coming up next on My First Quilt. Hi there, I'm Sara Gallegos and you're watching My First Quilt. Today we're working on a snail's trail block and it comes together with paper piecing. You have a lot of perfect little points that come together on one of these sorts of blocks, so it's the optimum opportunity to use paper piecing methods. So let's look at what the actual block is. Right here is our snail's trail block. And this is a fun one to put together. The pattern is called Big Sky Blues, and in the image you'll see that they've used all blues and beiges. On mine I decided to use light pinks and dark pinks. You can really pull together a lot of collection of fabrics to create this quilt, or you could make it more orderly. There are a lot of different options. But again, it all starts with paper piecing. So I'm going to take away the quilt and bring up the papers and show you how we begin. The first step in creating this quilt is to prepare your papers. This is paper pieced and I've used actual paper piecing paper that goes right through my printer, so I could just print off the pattern itself. They're 8.5 by 11 sheets, so then I cut off the base of the paper just so that I have a smaller piece to work with. And you want to make sure that they all print off the exact same size, so make sure you print them on the same printer. It's a lot of papers to create this entire quilt, and now we're ready to start each block. Each block consists of two fabrics. You've got a light and a dark, and you can kind of mix it up throughout the quilt. So here I've got all of my light and dark pieces. There are several different sizes of triangles, but you're also going to create a 4-patch unit. So you want to place your 4-patch on this first portion of the pattern, and it says area 1. That's letting you know which place you're going to place it. The other thing that you need to pay attention to is it tells you that blue or navy, which is the dark, this is based off of their pattern, goes left and right, and then cream or tan, which they used as their light, goes up and down. That's important to make sure that the direction of your snail's trail block is in the right orientation. So here I've got my 4-patch and it's going to lay right on there, but we need to flip the paper over. We're going to be adding this to the blank side of the page because we stitch on the stitching lines from the right side. So I like to just kind of pick up my paper so that I can see through it a little bit, and I'm going to position my piece so that it's directly over that 4-patch area. Now, one more thing to point out on the 4-patch is there are these dashed lines. Those represent the seam lines on your 4-patch. So when I'm positioning this on the underside, I'm making sure that my seam lines, or my ditches from my seams, are directly in line with those dashed marks. I've got it exactly positioned, but now we need to hold it into place to stitch. You could use a pin, but I actually think it's easier to use a glue stick. I love when I can use a handy little tool like this. So I'm just going to kind of peel back the edge of my 4-patch and add a little glue. And I'm just making sure that I don't twist my block around as I'm doing this. You can kind of add it to all 4 edges. This glue washes away in your finished quilt. It's not going to disrupt the quilt whatsoever. I really like working with it. There we go. So now it's all glued into place and I don't have to worry about this shifting or moving around as I take it to the machine to stitch. Now let's flip it back over and see where we add our next piece. That was area 1. Now we're going to move into area 2, and it tells me again this is where I want to place a dark or a blue fabric. So right here I'm going to flip it over and that becomes this section here. Now I'm going to place my first and smallest dark triangle right up to the edge of my 4-patch, and now I need to stitch. You could use a pin or just really carefully flip it over, and when we stitch we want to make sure that we're stitching on the line right here that goes directly between area 1 and area 2. So you're going to start in the corner and stitch all the way down. So I'll take it to the machine and stitch that first seam. So I've got a center needle straight stitch, and I'm lowering my foot just so that I can see that the center needle marking on my foot is right in line with my line, and I'll stitch right down. Good deal. Now you do not have to worry about locking in your stitches at the beginning and end of each of your seam because you are going to be intersecting those seams again when you add another piece. So now that we've stitched, we want to fold back on our paper just like this. And I like to just give it a little finger press. When you finger press it like this, you're actually sort of perforating right around your stitching line, and that's going to make it easier when it comes time to remove all of the papers from the back of the quilt. Now we want to trim off some of that seam allowance, and I have here an add a quarter ruler. It's got a little lip on the underside. I really like working with this type of a ruler because it's got that little lip, so I can place that right up against my seam allowance and the edge of my paper, hold it in place, and then snip, and it gives me a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to fold back my paper, and now we find area number 3. So over here, and again it tells us this should be a dark fabric. I'm going to flip this back over again, and now we're going to add the second of our smaller dark triangles. Now I'm feeling that the tip of my triangle is right along that center seam allowance line. All of these pieces are cut generously. You've got a lot of excess that gets cut off, so you don't have to worry quite so much about centering your triangles because just by the nature of paper piecing, everything's going to come out perfect. But I like to, just to ensure accuracy, feel that that center stitch line is right in line with my tip of my triangle. So now I'll flip it back over and I'm ready to stitch on the next line. Okay, now we're ready to fold back on our stitching line. There we go. And we're going to trim that seam allowance once again. Perfect. And now we look for the next section to sew, which is going to be number 4. And it's letting me know that this is where I start with my cream or my lighter colored blocks. So I'm going to flip that over. And at this point, I'm adding the first of my light colored triangles along this edge here. And I'm going to repeat the exact same process. So now I'm going to stitch on this side and then add another lighter colored triangle down here. I'll trim both of those off as we go, and then we're ready to work on the next ring of our snail's trail. Now that I've stitched and trimmed both of those pieces, I'm ready to give it a good press. So just open out those triangles and press. There we go. And now we're ready to add the next size of triangles, or the next set. So I'm looking for number 6, which is next, and it tells me that I'm starting with the navy. So I'm going to go ahead and add the darker colored 6 and 7 pieces, and then my lighter colored 8 and 9 pieces, and we'll have created another ring around our snail's trail. Well, here I have my completed snail's trail block. If it's a little bit crooked like mine is, don't worry about it because there's a lot of excess in here that we're going to end up cutting off. Another thing that I want to point out, if you're making your block and you are using an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, your pieces are not completely centered on that piece of paper. That was a mistake I made in the very beginning. I was kind of trying to line up those pieces with the edges of the paper, and that makes no sense at all. You're really only worrying about the lines on the back. Now, when it comes time to trim, we're going to cut on the dashed marked lines. Those marked lines are dashed because that includes your seam allowance. When you put all of your blocks together, you do stitch on the solid line. So I love that on this particular paper piece pattern, all of my seam allowances are built right in. There we go. And we're not going to remove the paper yet. So after we have trimmed this, you can lay out all of your blocks. And you want to kind of lay them out so that darks touch darks and lights touch lights, and that's what kind of gives you the linked effect of the snail's trail quilt. But you want to leave all of the paper in until all of your blocks have been stitched together, because it does kind of help to keep everything together. So you're literally stitching through all of these papers, and then after you have sewn your entire quilt together, you're going to come in, and because of the fact that we kind of creased on the lines as we cut, all of those papers should tear off fairly easily because it's perforated. So this is kind of a nice little TV watching project to work on, or maybe when you're riding in the car with somebody, you could be tearing out all those paper pieces. For another project I did, I set up a tote bag with a trash bag inside of it on a car ride and just tore out all the paper as I went. And then this one, my kids were even helping me. So you're just going to tear off all of those papers, and then you'll have your completed quilt. Let's take another look at that. So here's the completed quilt. And once again, when you're lining all of your blocks up, you want to make sure that when you place them, you're putting all of your darks together. You end up with almost like a little square of darks, and then you've got all of your lights together throughout the quilt, and that's what gives you that effect of the snail's trail. I hope that you've enjoyed learning about this block. I love this style of paper piecing. It's a really fun project to make, and I love that you can use up lots of fabrics all in one quilt. Thanks so much for watching. My First Quilt is brought to you by Baby Lock, Free Spirit Fabrics, Madeira, and Hobbs Batting.